In this video, we're going to discuss the differences between IDEs, integrated development environments, and just plain text editors. Maybe even a few fancy text editors just thrown in for good measure. So I'm going to start off with sort of the top end of that spectrum, integrated development environments, also known as IDEs. This is the main programming tool that programmers use to create excuse me. This is the main tool that programmers use to create software. And what we have in front of us here is probably the granddaddy of them all. And what we have here is probably the big dog out of all of them, at least on the Windows side. This is Visual Studio. Now, Visual Studio comes in 3 different flavors. There's Visual Studio Community Edition, which is free for certain... Now, there are 3 different flavors of Visual Studio. There's Visual Studio Community, which is a free version of Visual Studio. There are some licensing requirements that you need to adhere to in order to qualify for the free version, such as you have to be a small development company. I don't remember the exact terms. These are probably going to change anyway over time, so look them up. But to my understanding, if you have 5 or fewer developers, then you can use the free version. You can use it for commercial software development. You just can't be a big company. And I think there's also a revenue requirement on there. You can't make more than a certain amount, and it's a pretty generous amount. So if you're a fledgling software developer, if you're developing by yourself, if you're a student, all of these criteria certainly qualify you for the Community Edition. And there is no difference between the Community Edition and the Professional Edition, there is no difference between the Community Edition and the Professional Edition. And there is no difference between the Community Edition and the Professional Edition, aside from the license. It's just a licensing difference. So the next one up, and I would guess I would use up in air quotes, is the Professional Edition. Again, it doesn't do anything that Community Edition doesn't do. That's there just for companies that don't meet the requirements of Community Edition with respect to the free license. And then the next step up from there is Visual Studio Enterprise. Visual Studio Enterprise has sort of all of the bleeding edge features in it that Professional lacks. So all of these cool new tools that Microsoft comes up with, they put them in Enterprise. So there's some things that Enterprise can do that Professional can't. It's got different debuggers. It's got code visualization tools. We're not going to need any of that stuff for this particular course. I just happen to have Enterprise on my development machine. I just happen to have Enterprise on my development VM, and it's a fresh install, so I thought it would be a great opportunity to just show you sort of without me having added anything into it. I usually add additional tools into Visual Studio, such as ReSharper, which is a productivity tool. I haven't added anything to this, so this is sort of an out-of-the-box plain vanilla install. This is just sort of an out-of-the-box plain vanilla install of Visual Studio. So we're going to start with this because it makes more sense to show you the full featured one and then talk about text editors based on what they don't have, rather than try to get you to imagine coming at it from the other direction. It's just easier this way. So again, this is Visual Studio. This is Microsoft's long-standing integrated development environment. It's been around for decades in one form or another. It started off as Visual Basic way back in the day, when the only languages, I should say, that Microsoft had in the beginning were Visual Basic and C++. So it started off there, and one of the greatest interface designers recognized by Microsoft, I think, is Alan Cooper, and Alan Cooper designed the user experience for this, and that was 30 or so years ago, and they've just been improving on it ever since. So this is really one of the best IDEs on the market, in my humble opinion, and I know there are a lot of people that share that sentiment. So let's take a look at what it can do. This is just the opening screen that you get. I'm going to use the little shortcuts over here to create a new project. And you'll find that there are a lot of project types in here depending on how you installed Visual Studio. You have some options up front, and you can decide what you want to install and what you don't want to install. For example, if you don't need Visual Basic, then you don't have to install it, and that will save you some space. if you don't ever need Visual F Sharp, you don't have to install it. It'll save you some space. If you put everything on there, you're looking at somewhere between 9 and 18 gigs, depending on what you pick. So it can take up a lot of room, but again, this is your primary tool. If you were a software developer, this is what you use all day, every day, and so it's important to have good tools. All right, so if you look down the side, you'll see that we have templates for all the different languages and types of projects that you can create. And this course is about C#, so we're just going to focus on this. And I'm going to create just one of the simplest kinds of applications that you can create, and that's a console application. And I'm going to create the normal Hello World project that everybody... Actually, I'm not going to make Hello World. We're tired of that, right? I'm going to make one called Burnt Pancake, right? Because whenever you make a pancake with a new griddle or a new stove, you always wind up throwing the first one away because you screw it up. So whenever I get a new IDE or a new tool to play with or a new language, I always make a burnt pancake. That way I'm not upset if I throw it away, because I probably am going to throw it away. All right, so there's a lot of things down here that we'll need to cover a little bit later. I want to stay focused on the differences between what an IDE is and what a simple text editor will do for you. So just going to make this project real quick, and we're not going to worry about what these options are. We'll talk about them later on. So when the project comes up, you'll see we have a couple of areas in our tool that lets us navigate our project. So I'm going to come over here and show you this area first. Normally, the first thing you're going to see is a Solution Explorer. And the Solution Explorer is what shows you where all the files are in your project. Now, this is not necessarily a one-to-one mapping. If you were to go out and compare the directory structure of your project, it wouldn't exactly match this, but it would be pretty close. So we can do that. We can go look real quick. Just right-click on your project and find the option that says Open Folder in File Explorer, and you can go find it. So we can see that we have properties. The app.config is there. Burnt Pancake is the name of the project. You're not going to see it over here because it's the project file that actually is open right now. So you're not going to see a reference to that. And then you're going to see this program.cs file. So these are the files, but you'll notice that we have these triangles next to them indicating that we can open them up. And now we're actually inspecting parts of the code that resides in that file. So if I double click it, it's actually already open, but if I double click this, it will open in the editor. And I can see that at this point it really is just a text editor. I can type in here and it's just text like Notepad, except that it's not, right? You can now see that except that it's not, right? You can now see that Visual Studio is starting to give me hints about mistakes that I've made. So in a word processor, Microsoft Word or whatever you use is going to tell you by red underlines or some other indicator that you've made some sort of mistake that it recognizes. If you misspell a word, if you use poor grammatical structure, if you put too many commas or too few commas, it's going to recognize that and it's going to tell you you're making a mistake. The same is true here in Visual Studio. It realizes that it's expecting some source code, some code written in C#, and what I just typed in there doesn't conform to that requirement, and so it's underlining it and saying, hey, I have no idea what you're doing here. So that's fine. We'll get rid of it. All right, now there's a lot of stuff in here, and we don't really need to talk about what all of this means yet. Again, we're just comparing the differences between plain text editors and an IDE. So I'll go ahead and put something in here just so that we have something to look at. So I'll put in console.writeLine, which will write a line of text out to our console. And I'll just say, this is a burnt pancake, and I'll end my line of code with a semicolon. That's like ending a sentence with a period in C#. Almost everything ends with a semicolon. So we'll keep that in mind. I'll go ahead and save this, and now I'll build it. So Microsoft Visual C#. And now I'll build it. C# is a compiled language, so you do have a build step where you have to go in and build the final executable of your program. We contrast this with a scripting language like Python or PHP or Perl, where you don't have a compile step. You just run the interpreter and give it the name of the script that you want to run. But in C#, you have to compile. So this is one of the big differences between an IDE and a text editor. You have access to the compile and build tools, and you can find them up here in Visual Studio under Build. So if I select Build, and then I can either build my solution or I can just build this particular program. Now I only have one program in my solution. You can see over here I have a solution, and then there's the program. I can have multiple programs, multiple projects inside my solution. For example, I might have a simple program that I want to sell, and then I'll turn around and go ahead and make the website for that project also in Visual Studio, and I'll have everything related to that product in one solution, and that's kind of nice. Sometimes you have several programs that work together, and you want to have those in a single solution. It makes them easier to track, and also it also makes it easy if they depend on one another. So maybe you make a programming library, and then you consume that programming library somewhere else. So these are probably things we won't cover in depth in our C# Unity course, but it's good to know that that stuff's there. So that's what this is all about, and we can come over here and build this by using either of these. So I'm just going to hit the first one, Build Solution. It builds all of the projects that are in there, and I could do a Control-Shift-B, and that will build as well. So I'm just going to click that, and I'm going to get a window down here that's going to show me my build progress. And after a couple of seconds, hopefully a couple of seconds, we should get a successful result if I haven't made any mistakes. And it says here that the build succeeded. None of them failed. All of are 0 up to date, 0 skipped. So the one that I really care about, of course, is I want to see that 1 succeeded. And again, since I only have the one project in here, that's pretty much what I'm expecting. So I have access to the build tools. What did this do for us? Let's go out and look. If I, again, go back and open this in File Explorer, I'll see that there are a couple of folders in there that I didn't really talk about. And those are the bin and obj folders. So you don't see those over here. And that's because these are produced when you build your software in Visual Studio. So bin, or binary, if you want to think of it that way, is the final result of your build. And you can see that there's a folder here called debug. The reason for that is because Visual Studio supports different configurations, and you can see up here we have a configuration called debug. We also have one called release. And so these are two different settings that you'll want to change as you move through your software development lifecycle. And really, these are just going to apply for individual developers. You're writing some code as a student, you're writing some code just you, and you want to manage your debug and release builds from this tool. There are different tools that you would use if you were in a team setting that would handle that for you. But that's what the debug means when we go look at this folder. If we were to set this to release, there would be a folder down here called release, and I can do that very quickly. I'll set it to release, and I'll go ahead and build it, and we will see when that finishes. Since I didn't change anything, it finished very quickly. I can see that now there is a release folder here, and the difference between the two is an optimization level. Debug adds some what we call symbols into the build that allow us to debug our programs, but it also slows them down a little bit and makes our final executable a little bit larger, at least in theory. The release folder, on the other hand, is designed to be shipped. This is the software that you would ship to your end customers, your end users. And so it is optimized a little bit more than the debug one. So this one is useful for programmers to check their work, and this one is the one that you would actually hand out to your end users. So these build configurations are one of the things that's primarily different between just a plain text editor and an IDE. A text editor is not going to have access to these things. I'll let the police go by. Taking their own sweet time. So building is probably the biggest feature that you get in an IDE like Visual Studio that you don't get in a text editor. There are a few really important ones that we should look at that are a little less obvious. Now, I already showed you writing a line in here. Let's do another one and just sort of point out what's going on here. As soon as I start typing, if it understands what I'm typing is part of C#, then it's going to give me something that Microsoft calls IntelliSense. These are little hints that you can use, and they really save you a lot of time because having typed CON, and I'm looking for console, and it has figured that out, all I have to do at this stage is hit tab, and it will go ahead and complete that for me. Next, I'll hit dot, and I'll type WR, and it knows that I just typed right line a second ago, so it's assuming that I want right line again. And so again, all I have to do is hit tab to control, so again, all I have to do is hit tab. Let me do that part again. Now if I hit dot and start typing right line again, now I just typed right line, and it knows that. And so it assumes that I'm going to want right line again. You'll notice it went right to it, no pun intended. And as soon as I type the first few letters to really narrow this down, I can again hit tab or even space, and it will complete that for me. Now space, in this case, I'm going to have to hit backspace to get back to where I wanted to be, but you can hit tab, you can hit space. There are different options for that. I can open my parentheses, and you'll notice that it automatically creates my closer parenthesis for me. This is great for new developers as well as seasoned veterans. One of the things that we often forget to do is close whatever we open. So that's one thing I want you to start memorizing and remembering now. If you open it, you have to close it. If you open parentheses, you have to have closed parentheses. If you open a quote, you have to close a quote. If you open curly braces, you have to close curly braces. And that is a source of a lot of programming mistakes called syntax errors. All right, so we'll go ahead and add something else in here. And the other thing that you might note is that everything is a different color. So you'll get used to the different color codes as you go through this. So as I write some text in the form of a string, that's going to get this sort of orangish color. And that is how you can differentiate different parts of your code, and it lets you visually see if there are problems. For example, if I make a mistake, let's say I had neglected to close the quotation on the end of line 13 over here. So let me get rid of that. And now you can see, oh, there's something wrong here. So we're seeing semicolons, and we're seeing a parenthesis that are not the right color, and then we're seeing the little red squiggles. That's a visual clue that something is wrong. So let me go ahead and close that back up again. And so it's really trying to help you not make quite so many mistakes. As it turns out, programming computers is a very error-prone practice. And so the tools that you can use that will help you reduce those errors are going to save you time, energy, frustration, and screens, as angry programmers tend to throw them. All right, so you're starting to get the gist of this, right? There's one more thing that I want to point out that the IDEs do for you that the text editor doesn't. And you've seen me do it already. It creates this structure over here, this structure that you're going to need for your project. So if you're going to write plain C# programs with just, say, Notepad, a simple text editor, and you can compile from the command line if you really want to, you're still going to have to make a lot of these support files. So you're probably going to need an app config file. You're probably going to need a project file that contains your references. And all of that stuff gets built by the IDE automatically. So a project file, again, is just a text file. I can actually look at what this looks like, and I can change it. I have to do a little bit of trickery, though. Since it's open right now, I can't really edit it. So what you want to do if you want to edit, and in this case, we're just going to look at it. We're going to unload the project, and then we're going to go ahead and edit that project. And now you can see all of the stuff that the IDE put in here for me. It's gone ahead and set up all of my build configurations. It's gone ahead and given me everything that I need in terms of my imports. All of that stuff is going to be in here along with the structure itself. I can see what files go in here. And I even have build targets in here for later on. And I even have build targets in here for later on when I want to use an automated build system. For example, TeamCity or Microsoft Team Center. This is a level of tooling that you would use when you were writing professional software rather than just doing student work. You would create some sort of build server that handles all of that stuff for you. I mentioned earlier that this release and debug setting is really only used by students and solo developers that aren't worried about having any sort of process. But when you get into a more formal process, you need these kinds of settings and these kinds of configurations. And it would just be time consuming and quite frankly pretty painful to try to do this in Notepad. So really, if you want to be productive in C#, you're going to use an IDE and you're not going to use a text editor. So let's take with that bias in mind, let's take a look at a text editor. Didn't mean to do that. Edit that part out. With that bias in mind, let me go ahead and reload this so that it's back the way it was. And now we're back to our normal editing mode. Let me go into a text editor and sort of show you the things that it has going for it. The one that I'm going to show you is actually a very nice text editor. It's nicer than Notepad. I'm assuming everyone knows what Notepad is. Notepad is just the most basic text editing program that you can use. And the one thing that it does for you is that it makes sure that the files that you save out are plain text files. Text files are different from another kind of file called binary files, and that's what you would get if you were to write out something with, say, WordPad or Microsoft Word or a word processor. You're not going to get a text file, you're going to get a binary file that correlates to that particular program that created it. In this case, you want text. Text is a form of data that all computers recognize. And there are a few differences between platforms, such as how line endings are processed, but pretty much any computer can understand and compensate for those differences. And so a text file is really, it's important that you understand what this is. It's one of the most important concepts in programming, and that is that source code, which is the set of instructions that we create that which is the set of instructions that we create that comprise our program. Those are written out in text files, which means you can literally open and edit them in pretty much anything. So having written this program, a little bit of this program in C#, I can now open this if I wanted to in another text editor like Notepad. So we'll do that just so you can see. I will take a little bit of a shortcut. I have it open down here already, right? So I'll just come over here and I will get my path real quick so I don't have to browse to it. And I'll do a file open and I'll put my path in there to save me a little bit of time. Now, Notepad doesn't understand what a C# file is. It doesn't know what the CS extension is. You'll note that our program has a CS extension. That's the only code file in our project right now. And by default, Notepad only looks for .txt extensions. So the first thing you have to do is overcome that and switch this to all files. And now you can see that we have all of these files in here. And we're going to look at program.cs. So there it is, and you can see that fundamentally there's no difference between the two. The same text is there, but we lack all of the hints, right? So if I want to add something over here, another line of console.writeLine, it's not going to tab for me automatically, so I'm going to have to hit tab and then figure out how to space over so that everything matches. And then I would have to type in here, and it's really easy. Oh, I made a mistake. Look at that. So if I were over here in the IDE, it would have told me that I made a mistake before I went too far into this. This is not going to give me any help whatsoever. When I want to build this program, I'm going to have to go out to a command prompt to do that, and that's far less convenient than, say, coming up here and just clicking the build button or learning the control keys that will let me do that. So building would look a little like this. Let me do it this way. there is actually a command prompt in here that should make it a little easier. There it is, developer command prompt, and then there's an MS build command prompt. I don't think that's going to make a difference. So I'll go ahead and open this up. And now I need to go to the location where my program is. And that's not going to work very well. So I may not even be able to, oh, I know what I can do. No, that's not going to work either. You can already see that I'm starting to have to try and figure out a way to actually get to my code. And whereas over here, I would just click a button. So if we eventually figure this out, we can go to, yeah, this is flat out not going to work. I don't think I can go to PSF, can I? Yeah. Maybe I can do PSF like that. No, that's not going to work either. So this is a UNC file name. And the reason that is there, this is a little easier if I were using a straight Windows setup, but I'm not. I'm actually running Parallels on my Mac. So this is trying to map to a drive on my Mac. And again, the IDE does that really, really simply. And this is not going to do that. I frankly don't even know how to get to that file location. So what I would need to do at this stage would be to move it to another location that I can easily reference with a Windows path name instead of a UNC path name. So you're already starting to see how much work you would have to go through just to use Notepad. And why would you use something, you know, just plain Jane, plain vanilla like that, and then have to go through all of this when literally you can use a tool that will let you click the button. Now let's look at something in between Notepad and Visual Studio. And I actually advocate that everybody have a text editor like this on your system, because there are times when it's just handy to be able to make a quick edit to a file. You don't need to do a build. You don't need to do anything fancy or IDE-ish. This is an intermediary. So what we can do on this one is we can open a file, and I'll paste in my path again. And it is going to know different file types. So it understands source code files. This is what it's for. You know that there is a setting here for C# files, but pretty much everything is in here, every language that you can think of. And if it's not here, then this particular program, which is called Notepad++, allows you to add plugins so that other languages maybe that it doesn't ship with can be understood. And if you have a language that isn't in its capabilities list, even through a plugin, it's actually really easy to make your own language definition file for this. It literally is, you know, a couple of hours probably of text editing, but you can make your own for this, and it's not hard. You don't have to learn C++ or anything like that. So let's take a look at what our program looks like in Notepad++, and you can see that, oh, it looks a little better than it did in Notepad. We actually have some color coding. I'm going to make this a little larger so that we can see it a little easier. And to do this, I'm just holding down Control and using the mouse wheel, the roller on my mouse, to make that a little bit bigger so we can see it. And so again, this is sort of in between. So we have some syntax highlighting. That's what the color coding thing is about. And it's going to do automatic indents for me. So if I want to come in here and make an edit to this, I can press enter. It's going to respect my indentations. And it actually does a little bit of code completion for me. Now, it's not doing it the same way that Visual Studio does it. Visual Studio actually understands the language, and it can look inside of various files and see what the various code hints should be. Notepad++ doesn't do that. What it actually does is it looks at what you have created before. So it sees that I've written a line called console.writeLine, and since it sees that I've done that before, it's offering to allow me to do that again. Likewise, it understands the word using because it sees it at the top of the file. So if I were to type in using in here, then it would see that and allow me to use it. And then the other thing that it understands is just basic C# keywords. There are 30 or 40 basic C# keywords that it knows about. And so if I type short, it's going to know that that is something that it can use. Likewise, I can type in int and it will know that I can use that. So it knows the basic C# language structures and allows you to do code completion with that, but it's not going to have visibility into the objects themselves. So if I were to type console and I didn't want write line this time, I would want to do something else. Well, it knows about write line and it knows about write, but there are dozens of other things that I would have gotten over here if I had tried this with Visual Studio. I could come in here and type console dot, and you can see that I have all of this stuff in there. And that's because Visual Studio knows intimately what everything in that object is, whereas Notepad++ doesn't know those things. It can guess based on files that you give it, but unless you were to explicitly define everything, then it wouldn't be able to tell you that. And explicitly defining everything really is not practical, because you would have to come up with every single library that's available for C#, including the stuff that Microsoft didn't write, and then create code hints for that. So that's not really all that practical. So your best option is to use an IDE. Sometimes you don't want an IDE because you just want to make a quick edit. And in those cases, you know, it can take a minute or two or sometimes more for your IDE to come up. You just want to do something fast. There are a lot of other reasons why you want a good text editor on here. Maybe you want to do something with a macro, or you want to do something with reformatting a file. There's just useful things that you can do in a text editor for which doing it in an IDE would be an overkill situation. So I like to have both of these programs on here. And then there's Notepad on there, but I don't ever use it for anything. So let me just close that and we'll forget that it's even there. So those are the main differences between text editors and IDEs. IDEs being the preference, as they do everything that you would want them to do, and with a minimum of fuss. And then text editors, they're fine if you want to make a quick edit, but they're not the tool that you're going to use day in and day out. And I guess I'll close by showing you one more thing. I've done everything on Windows, but of course we can work on the Mac as well. So if we're going to work on the Mac, particularly with Unity development, we're going to use a tool called MonoDevelop. And MonoDevelop is a lot like Visual Studio, except that it's cross-platform. So let's bring up MonoDevelop so you can see that. And since it's MonoDevelop, MonoDevelop is not really a product any longer. It used to be a standalone IDE, just like Visual Studio, open source, really nice. You could go get it and download it and use that to create C# programs on alternate platforms like Linux and Mac. But it doesn't exist anymore. If you try to get MonoDevelop by itself, you're going to get another product called Xamarin Studio. Let me just show you where that is. Looking to go get some shoes later. And so the team that came up with MonoDevelop actually sort of productized it and turned it into a product called Xamarin, Xamarin. And they're focusing on the mobile space. So it allows you to create cross-platform mobile development. So it allows you to create cross-platform mobile apps, say for the iOS, Android, all of the different mobile platforms. You can make your software with just one tool, and that's kind of nice. So that's where the focus is on this thing. And so that leaves us wondering, well, what happened to MonoDevelop? There is a fork of it still out there. There's a copy of it out there that, since it's open source, we can use it. We can do things with it. And that's what Unity has done. They've created their own fork of MonoDevelop, and they've put some optimizations in there for Unity. So what we're seeing here is the optimized version for Unity. And I can, in fact, do a lot of the same things that I can do in Visual Studio. So you can't see the top of my screen in this case, but I'm going to create a new solution. And I can create a new solution in here the same way that I can in Visual Studio. I'm not going to go through that exercise, but you understand that it's pretty much the same thing. We have the selection of languages down the side, just as we did in Visual Studio. There are a few in there that are not in Visual Studio, like Boo. Boo is designed to be a Python-like language. And in Visual Studio, you can just use one of the different flavors of Python, like IronPython or just plain Jane Python, the normal Python distribution. Now has tooling in Visual Studio. So you can do different languages just like you can in Visual Studio. It's just a shorter list. And we can make a C# program just as we did earlier. All of these things are possibilities just like they are in Visual Studio. This is an IDE, so you are going to get code hints. So if I were to come in here and type console.writeline, it actually wouldn't work because I don't have the import for it, would I? Let's just put it in there real quick so we can do apples to apples, more or less. I made an apple joke, didn't I? Didn't even know it. Okay. Now with that in there, I should be able to do console.writeline. And you can see that it works pretty much the same as it did in the other one. So we've got a different color scheme, but you can see that it has all of those features in there. And when you're working with Unity, you don't need to build, but you can. And I can't show you that because it's off the screen. Let me fix that. All right, that's better. I've adjusted the recording so that it will get the top of the Mac screen, and now you can see the whole thing. So now you can see that we have these build capabilities up here at the top. And so if I want to build my project, I can, just as I could in Visual Studio. Now, when you're working with Unity, the project is always going to be called Unity. It's not going to have its own special name. So we'll go ahead and say build Unity. And I think I've actually seen it. Say other things over here, like assembly C#. But that's essentially how it works, and it pretty much does everything again that Visual Studio does. We really wouldn't run it, but we can debug, we can build, we can do all of these things that we would like to do. So this is a fully featured IDE. I think you'll find this is just my opinion, it's not quite as polished as Visual Studio is. And you can actually, when you're working with Unity, switch your IDE from MonoDevelop to something else. Of course, that's only available in Windows because you can't run Visual Studio easily on a Mac. So when you're on a Mac, this is mostly going to be what you're using in terms of your IDE. But on Windows, you can use Visual Studio or this, or if somebody ever comes out with another IDE for C#, you'll be able to use that as well. You can also change what you want to use with respect to your editor. Let me fire up Unity and show you where that is. So it's a setting. So inside of Unity, I can go into my preferences, and it'll be in a slightly different place on the Windows side. It'll be under Edit, I think, if memory serves. But anyway, it's in your preferences, and then you'll just come over here and find external tools, and you can set your external script editor to whatever you'd like. So by default, it's going to say MonoDevelop. It might say something slightly different on Windows, but you can browse and you can go to any program on your system. So if I wanted to, I could browse to any text editor that I like, any IDE that I like. And you can even set things like how the command line passes things over. So there's some neat little things that you can do in there if you want to use a different IDE other than MonoDevelop or Visual Studio. That capability exists. So that's where you set it. And that, I guess, is the conclusion for IDEs versus text editors. So I think most of the time you're going to find using an IDE is going to save you a lot of time, energy, and frustration.